At the same time, China's foreign ministry says the decision was nothing new, stressing that multilateral institutions exist to serve the common interests of all countries rather than the priorities of any single nation. Foreign Ministry spokesperson Mao Ning saying the UN-centered international system has helped maintain global peace and stability, promote economic and social development, as well as safeguarding equal rights among countries for about 80 years. Senior researcher on African governance and diplomacy at the South African Institute of International Affairs, Gustavo de Carvalho, joins us live now for this discussion. Gustavo, good evening to you, and thank you so much for your time. So, given what the U.S. president has been saying with some of his, administrators, can we really say that we're surprised by this decision?
Thank you very much for having me. And indeed, it was predictable. It was entirely predictable in terms of the direction that we've seen the Trump administration taking, but still was quite stunning when it comes to the scope of it. Trump had already withdrawn from the WHO, from the Paris Agreement, from UNESCO, and had done this big review ordered last year to look into what multilateral institutions would be done. But when we look into the 66 organizations that simultaneously were affected by it, it shows not only quite a unprecedented movement in terms of abandoning those institutions, but also quite an indiscriminate approach. To a certain degree, I think what it showcases to us is that the United States is increasingly telling us that their foreign policy views multilateralism itself as contrary to their interest, not just specifically to the idea of some institutions being more ineffective than others. And particularly when we look into how the U.S. presents its own interests through the national security strategy that was presented in December, it does show that the U.S. is not really interested in being dominating every single aspect of international discussions, but really to pushing for their views, their approaches, and their ways in a very combative manner to be presented. And we're going to see very dire impact in terms of how multilateral institutions will be functioning from now on.
So in light of that then, where would you say the dangers are?
So there are many dangers, I would say here. I think one from a more philosophical perspective, perhaps in terms of the credibility and the understanding of what is the role of these institutions. We've seen a number of organizations that are fairly small in scope. Some of them I had never even heard of before. But also we've seen some really important institutions like those that are dealing with climate change, those that are dealing with family planning and reproductive rights, and particularly many of those that are dealing with African issues. So to a large degree, I think what we're going to see is for some of those institutions where the United States was already funding quite a bit of their annual budget. UNFPA, the United Nations Fund, Population Fund, the United States had over 40% of the funding for family planning, for instance. But on others like the Peacebuilding Commission and particularly the Peacebuilding Fund, where it has received very limited U.S. support and very limited U.S. funding. So we're going to see different impacts, but certainly one of those is that it provides another challenge for the United Nations that is already facing a major budget constraints, that is already facing a major legitimacy crisis and difficulties to respond to particular crises. So when we see Washington signaling this direction and withdrawing from some of these commitments, it does showcase that the type of fragmentation that we're going to see from now on in terms of multilateral institutions will continue. And it's there for us then to look into how do we continue and move on supporting those institutions that are perceived as particularly beneficial for many countries in the world, and particularly those in the African continent that have a very high attention by many of those organizations.
And I wonder, while the efforts continue in that regard, could we see other countries perhaps trying to step in to assist potentially?
We might, but it is a difficult process, and it requires intentionality from countries. We've seen, for instance, when the United States left the WHO, that China provided an extra $500 million. It is an important support, and it is an important new contribution, but it's very small in comparison to what the United States was providing. I think what is required at this stage, it is first that we need to look into different ways of providing financing to many of those institutions. I think it is also important to reflect all of those institutions. Can they be reformed? Can they be changed? Can they be adjusted and adapted? I think the fact that the arguments that there is inefficiency within the international organizations, that to a large extent it is correct. There is a challenge with many of these bureaucracies to show effectiveness, but at the same time we need to make them more efficient, more representative, and I think it does provide a space for stronger reform and for a stronger role of other countries. If the United States, that is the largest economy, that is the biggest power in the world, it is withdrawing from its not only interest but also a self-appointed responsibility in pushing those institutions forwards, we need to, from the rest of the world, to look into what are some of the ways and what types of coalitions, approaches and partnerships can be developed to ensure that the goals around climate adaptation, debt relief, pandemic preparedness are that we're still being able to respond to them rather than waiting for a moment that Washington would eventually return.
Speaking of Washington, the U.S. Secretary of State, that's Marco Rubio, he's described this particular decision by the administration as one that is progressive, but also now, interestingly, he speaks about these organizations. He says they are wasteful, ineffective, they are harmful, and they're not advancing the interests of the United States. So what are we to read into the meaning of U.S. interests, especially in this context?
I think it's a very good question, because to a certain extent it helps us to reflect how much more narrow the idea of national interest are within the Trump administration. The focus of the national security strategy is very much on developing a strong economy, creating a powerful military, securing its borders, and ensuring that the United States has a degree of technological preeminence. Everything else, whether it's climate stability, democracy promotion, gender, development assistance, they all seem to be considered to be wasteful. So in that regard, I think what it does provide us is that the multilateral institutions for the United States at the moment is that we're going to do what is interesting for us, and China would do what is interesting for them, Russia would do what is interesting for them. And as a result, and I think unfortunately what we have left with it is an approach of multilateralism and international relations that is far more transactional, that it sees the idea of cooperation not as something that is mutually beneficial. The ideas of win-wins are seen as much more with concerns. So that is important for us to really look into how the United States is moving, but also to show to the rest of the international community that there is still much that can be done. The United States is important and has been an important player in creating these institutions and really providing that kind of support. But at the end of the day, for the 192 countries that are left within the United Nations, that is not the United States, we need to talk very seriously about how can we pick up those pieces and build an institution that is beneficial to us as well.
Interesting times. Thank you so much for speaking to us, Gustavo. Appreciate it. And certainly this is going to be one of those moments where we wait to see what becomes the next move. Thank you so much. Appreciate your time. Senior researcher on African governance and diplomacy at the South African Institute of International Affairs, Gustavo de Carvalho.